I'm with Omer Benjakob, the tech editor of Haaretz, which is a newspaper in Israel, one of Israel's biggest newspapers, and Yossi Melman, a very well-known intelligence analyst who's written a book called Spies Against Armageddon. And today we're talking about the recent revelations of Pegasus, which, as we all know here in India and all over the world, I think is a spyware that has been sold by the Israeli company NSO to governments abroad, all over the world, including India. And lots of recent revelations which say that the Israeli police has been spying on a variety of the Israeli elite, including the former prime minister's son. But before I talk about those details, let me welcome you both to ThePrint. Gentlemen, welcome.
Hello.
Thank you.
So, Omar, let's start with you. Haaretz has been publishing a lot of stories about Pegasus. And of course, we're very interested in the India angle. We also know that the New York Times a few days ago published, along with an Israeli journalist and an American one, also did a big story on Pegasus and described it as the world's most powerful cyber weapon, in which there's an India angle, and we'll go into that. But your first comments on what's happening inside Israel, how big is this story and what's it doing to the political space?
Yeah, so I kind of offer a bit of a zoom out on this entire story. NSO is having a terrible year. Over the summer, Haaretz and 17 other news organizations led by a Paris-based NGO called Forbidden Stories published a string of revelations about the use of Pegasus, called the Pegasus Project, based on a massive leak of potential targets. Those targets, as people in India know, also included quite a large number of
Indian journalists
Indian journalists and generally Indian targets were within this database of potential targets. So that was over the summer. Since then, NSO stories have been coming out nonstop, also because this consortium of journalists has kept on working, but also because more and more details and different kind of aspects of their dealings have becoming public. This, in a sense, you could say, peaked in the past 2 weeks with a news story in Israel saying that also the Israeli police used it. So Israel has not only been selling this out, but also internal police forces have been using it, also against protesters and to a lesser extent journalists and mostly politicians or kind of people accused of corruption. And the second is, as you noted, the New York Times story. The New York Times story, this might sound a bit counterintuitive, but I would actually think of it as NSO's version of the event, because the New York Times story gives almost an internal account of the way NSO perceives their role. And they perceive their role not as someone who aids evil regimes or helps illiberal governments chase journalists, but rather they view themselves as what you could view as the front office for the Israeli diplomatic effort, and as a coin that the Israeli government has used to make inroads throughout the world. And one of the big kind of headlines that came out of the New York Times story was that, like we had always assumed, there was a sale to India as part of a $2 billion wider deal. One thing I do just want to add to that is we've kind of already known that NSO can only sell to states, and there were tons of Indian targets. I really doubt Israel sold to Pakistan, so that kind of narrows down the options of who would want to chase or to snoop on all these Indian journalists and activists. Right. So I think we always knew that. What we've also learned, and what I would add, is that this was part of a wider deal. In that sense, it's not just NSO. It's very likely India purchased a whole number of cyber-related defensive and offensive services from Israel.
Yeah, right. So, Yossi, can I bring you in here? You're a very well-known Israeli intelligence analyst. Now, what do you make of what's happening with NSO? So it's snooping outside, it's selling all this spyware to governments abroad, including in India and elsewhere in the world. But now it's the chickens are coming home to roost inside Israel. So it seems now the Israeli police is targeting its own elite, including former Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's son. But what's the message of this?
Well, let me pour cold water on the discussion and put things into perspective.
We count on you to do that, Yossi.
Exactly.
Israel has been using, via the Ministry of Defense and the Mossad, its military industries to promote, enhance, open diplomatic relations with countries which refuse to have open, direct relations with Israel. Mm-hmm. So Israel has been selling missiles, and you in India know better than anyone else that these kind of relations of weapons, which are worth billions and billions of dollars annually, have been established already in 1994, immediately after India renewed or opened its diplomatic relations.
Mm-hmm.
So Pegasus has to be dealt with and looked at in that perspective. Pegasus is just a weapon. Missiles, boats, airplanes, radars, anti-aircraft batteries, these are part of Israeli arsenal. Pegasus is one of them, and there are others, other intelligence-related equipment. Celebrite, Kandiro, and so on and forth. So that, and Israel has been using it, sometimes with the intervention of the Mossad, to facilitate the deals and to promote opening relations. That's one thing. The second thing is that it's almost a natural process when you produce such a lethal weapon, whether as Pegasus, and you sell it abroad to dubious regimes, and you don't care about the nature of the regime, and you wash your hands and your conscience by saying they signed a contract, everything is stipulated in the contract, it's not my duty or responsibility now to look what they are doing with these lethal tools. And that's what Israel and the NSO was telling the world when journalists were killed in Mexico, or via using Pegasus by the Mexican government, or Khashoggi in Saudi Arabia by the Saudi Arabia crown prince.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so it's a natural process. You sell it abroad, you use it by the Israeli security services against Palestinians in the occupied territories, and then you sell it to the Israeli police, and it finds its way into the hands of the Israeli police. However, there is a huge discrepancy between what the media is claiming,
Mm-hmm.
that 28 people were targeted, state officials, journalists, activists in Israel itself, and the admission by the police that only 3 people or 3 efforts were targeted, and out of the 3, 2 failed, which shows that either the police is incompetent, or Pegasus is not such a powerful tool.
No, but that's not the point. That's not the point, Yossi. The point is not whether Pegasus is competent or the Israeli police is incompetent. The point is that this spyware that is being used, and now, of course, you can argue that there is no such thing as a right to privacy. But, you made a point about dubious regimes. Now, I don't think India is a dubious regime. We are the world's largest democracy, whichever way you want to describe it. Now, you can also say that Israel and India signed a deal in 2017 when the Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi visited Israel in that year. And this was part of that deal. But why is it secret? Why doesn't Israel just come out transparently and say, yes, if we are selling missiles to India, you can surely sell spyware to India?
No. That's a question that you have to ask the Indian government, because when you do any kind of deal, whether it's a commercial deal or military deal, you sign. There is a clause in the agreement saying that you have to keep it a secret. It's like a commercial deal between 2 entities. Therefore, the question is why you are not transparent. It's not to be asked by the Israeli authorities or NSO. I'm not defending the Israeli government, but it's a question that has to be asked by the governments and the law enforcement agency, which both Pegasus. NSO has been bound to maintain it as a secret because that was part of the deal. But just to add one more point. In Israel, you can back telephones, you can listen to people, as long as it's part of an investigation and it's sanctioned by a judge. Mm-hmm. So the police is saying now, the Israeli police, all the 3 cases were sanctioned by a judge. In other words, it was legal. The big question is what wasn't legal, and I don't know about it.
Okay. Omar?
I want to add something because I think you raise an interesting point, and I think it's worth focusing on. I think it's very important to remember that the service NSO provides has in many senses existed since the Cold War, right? So the ability for a government to listen in on people is not in of itself a new phenomenon. But we know that such wiretapping, as Yossi explained, usually there's, since in the past 30, 40, 50 years, right, the moment we became aware of the politics of wiretapping, there's been regulation of it. We know, for example, that a judge needs to sign off, right? If you're a government, you want to go to your telecom agency and tell them, I want access to these people. Then it goes through some oversight. What I think is so scary about NSO or services like NSO, it's very important to remember that since they're not that unique, they might be the high end of this market, there are other kinds of services. They allow governments to do this in a case in which, one, they might not have been able to do it independently. So while tapping onto normal phones is easy, tapping onto mobile phones is harder. So it gives governments that may have not had this kind of ability, the ability to do so. And also they allow it to happen within kind of private, off-the-books aspect. And I think that's very scary. I think people don't understand that NSO is never sold, or at least not supposed to be sold to private bodies, but it allows states that don't necessarily have this capability in-house the ability to do that. And I think the combination of those two things is very scary, because when it happens within a state, right, right, because police department, right, focused on wiretaps, for example, there's some form of legislation saying that if the police want to wiretap you, they have to use that. And the moment it becomes like a service you can buy, then many times I think it kind of circumnavigates a lot of social processes that we usually have regulated it.
Sure. But Yossi, I think Omer makes a good point, which is that it's fine. Of course, you need the judge's authorization to wiretap. And, we shouldn't all be so scandalized, that what is this new spyware that is prying upon people? But, my question is that when Israel sells this spyware, now to you, the question is, does the Israeli government, did Prime Minister Netanyahu know personally that this spyware was being sold to countries like India, Saudi Arabia, pushing the Abraham Accords between the UAE, Bahrain? Does he know that? Did he sign off on that?
Sure he knew about it. Of course he knew it, because he was the prime minister. The defense minister knew about it. All the defense minister throughout this period since 2013 until today, and Netanyahu was in power since 2009 until recently. So of course he knew. Maybe he didn't know all the details. I'm sure that, but every tool, every software, Pegasus software or other softwares that were sold to countries outside Israel, you needed a license from the Israeli Ministry of Defense. You can. Not only that, in order to get a license, there are 3 stages. The first confirmation or license is just to open negotiations. If I want to negotiate with you, I have to inform the Ministry of Defense. Then, if I want to conclude the deal, I have to report to the Ministry of Defense and to get their permission. And then when I actually sell the stuff, ship it abroad, you need a license from the government. And therefore, yes, the prime minister knew about it, no doubt. Especially he knew about the deals with countries which Israel believed would help to form open or enhance relations, diplomatic relations with Israel, such as Saudi Arabia, which didn't open embassy in Tel Aviv and still don't have diplomatic relations, but United Arab Emirates, Bahrain, Morocco, all these countries wanted to have relations with Israel following Pegasus, but having the tool. But the tool was not the prime reason why these countries opened embassies in Tel Aviv. That's based on national security or mutual interest, and above all, when you're talking about United Arab Emirates, Bahrain, Morocco, it's the fear of Iran. This is the common ground which is binding Israel and these countries. The fear of Iran, Iranian efforts to establish its hegemony in the regions, and so on and so forth.
Okay, but I'm going to ask you the India question. Omar, to you first. All this is true. Of course, every country will use, all the information and the weapons that it has at its disposal, both civil and military, to push its agenda, right? That's fair. So, as Yossi explained, you have a 3-step process. with which you sort of sell all this stuff, especially the spyware. Now, India and Israel have a very good relationship. So when Prime Minister Modi visits Israel in 2017, Netanyahu says, okay, I mean, obviously there must have been, in the run-up to the visit, as Yossi explained, the Ministry of Defense of India and of Israel would have talked about such a deal? They would?
Yes, of course. For me, it's quite clear that I think Yossi makes a really important point here. We tend to think about these technological stories, spyware, is something that's very convoluted, that it's cyber. It's not cyber. Let's put that aside. It's like an arms deal. Yeah, it's like any arms deal that's been going on for the past 50, 60 years. Yeah, so there's nothing new. There's no big difference. So of course there's talks about it, and of course it has to coincide with a wider kind of alignment of interest. I think the relationship between Modi and Netanyahu was facilitated by shared interests, also shared politics. Yeah, I think a lot of the type of specific kind of right-wing politics they represent is in many senses very similar. Yeah, you can think about Netanyahu's relationship, Netanyahu's form of populism. It seems in many senses similar to Modi's. For example, you look at the way the discourse around Muslim people, for example. So I think there's a similarity, and I think they have a lot of shared affinities that go well beyond this or that specific deal. And I think that wider discourse does lay the groundwork for talks, which do lead to these kind of deals, in which NSO is only one facet. Yeah. So of course, yeah, like all these other kind of deals, it's built on a much wider form of cooperation, shared interest, and so on and so forth. And it's a classic military arms story.
But Yossi, if this is true, then and if you're saying that Netanyahu would have known that India wants to buy this spyware from Israel, and he would have had to sign off on it. But would the Israeli government need to ask, say, the Indian government, for example, hey, what are you going to use this for? Do they need to ask these questions?
No, they don't need to ask these questions. But in the contract between NSO and the Indian, I don't know, police force or army, which both purchased Pegasus, in that contract there are stipulations saying you have to use it properly. You have to use it according to the law. Now, of course, NSO is washing their hands by providing all these clauses in the agreement, and then they can say, we told the Indian government how to use it. I'm sorry, they use it differently. It's not our problem, it's their problem. There is a great deal of hypocrisy on all sides of this. The hypocrisy of those who are selling these weapons, they know exactly what kind of use they would do it in the war against crime and terror, but also some people, some government, some agency may divert it to use it to spy on their own people. And there is a great deal of hypocrisy on the side of the government who purchase it. Yeah. They sign agreement. We want this Pegasus just to fight terrorism and crime, but well, we use it also to go after our own dissidents, activists, rivals, and so on. And by the way, NSO is finished as a company. It has such a bad reputation that it's done. They have debt of $400 billion. They are now courts. They are in courts dealing with their various arguments and so on and so forth. It's finished as a company. The Americans put them on the blacklist. Yeah. That was the death certificate for any Israeli company to sell something when you are blacklisted by the Americans. However, there is a great hypocrisy by the Americans because the Americans are using these tools. You know how many innocent people the American army killed in Afghanistan or Iraq by their weapons? So,
yes.
It's a world full of, I don't want to use the S word, I would say hypocrisy.
Okay.
Omar. I want to add something to what Yossi said. I think it's a very, very, very important point. NSO is going down. This is the end. Once they're blacklisted, they can't do business in America. You can't do business in America, you're in trouble. India is a great deal to have, but the long term for these companies is selling to American police forces and going public. If that option is not available, they're done. But I want to surprise you and say I think this is actually very bad news, because we all know about NSO, right? We've been talking about NSO for a year. When they shut down, what do you think is going to happen? You think they're all going to give up and start working in non-profits, start volunteering with senior citizens, start volunteering, or are they going to open up 4 different companies we've heard of that have now learned from all these mistakes, maintain all their network that already existed, and then we'll have even less information? So I think there's a certain, this kind of circles back to your first question. Why doesn't the government admit? Because this entire field is based in secrecy. It's like that great scene in Dr. Strangelove where he says, what's the point of having a doomsday device if you don't tell anyone about it, right? So it's kind of like that. The secret is also power, and also the publication is also power. So it's very possible that by killing NSO now, we're going to get something much scarier and much worse across the world, not only from Israel.
Right. I think that's a good point that Omer makes. You see, it's not as these 3 men who started NSO, they're not going to sort of ride off into the sunset and, like Lawrence of Arabia or something. I mean, that's not going to happen, right? I suppose that some other company will buy their stuff and other things will happen. And perhaps there are other companies, not just in Israel, but perhaps elsewhere in the world that do practically the same kind of they produce the same kind of spyware.
Read my lips. NSO is going down the drain. There are other companies, their competitors in Israel and outside Israel, who are just waiting for the death certificate to be issued against NSO. Right. And then one day we will read about a US company which is using this technology, approved by the US administration, and selling it to many parts of the world. And obviously also other countries will follow accordingly. Other companies will learn it. I'm sure the Russians and the Chinese already have almost similar tools. If they did not steal these tools from whoever, so in reverse engineering or other methods, this is the world. This is today, and tomorrow it will be even worse.
Yeah. So the question to you, Omer, is, earlier you talked about shared interests and say shared ideologies between Netanyahu and Modi. Now, Naftali Bennett, your prime minister, is coming to India in June. Those are the reports. So I'm sure that, June is really a long time away from now. But if the story survives, I'm sure that he will be questioned on this. But what is his view today? I mean, we haven't read very much on what Mr. Bennett has to say.
If Netanyahu represents a very different kind of elite than what Israel used to have, Bennett represents the new Israeli elite. Bennett is from the Israeli high-tech. His money is from Israeli high-tech. It's in his bones to believe that high-tech and generally the cyber industry is very good. At least before the project Pegasus, before NSO had a really, really, really bad name, when they just had a kind of bad name, Naftali Bennett at the start of the coronavirus was suggesting NSO provide the Israeli government with tracking services for Israelis. So in theory, I don't think he's inherently against NSO. That being said, I do think that he's, unlike Netanyahu, he has less of a track record of needing them. So if Netanyahu used NSO for diplomatic currency, it's very possible Bennett doesn't need NSO and has other ways. But I don't think that at his core he has any problem with this. And like many in Israeli government or Israeli power, there's a connection. Like the same way there's a military defense establishment, there's also a military tech establishment at this point. And I don't think in that sense Naftali Bennett is some Luddite who thinks we should all be using landlines. I'll put it that way.
So Yossi, what has been the reaction? I mean, Netanyahu's son, for example, now it believes that NSO spyware were used to spy on him. Now that's ironical, isn't it? Because if the former prime minister is using this particular spyware to expand Israel's interests abroad, and now his own son is being spied upon, what are people saying?
Well, I'm not. Let's wait and see if really the Pegasus was used against the son of the prime minister. This is media report. The police is adamantly, refuting the story, saying we have no information about it. Now, of course, it's ironic that the prime minister who promoted these tools for diplomatic missions around the globe now is at the receiving end of it. It's like a boomerang. But there is even more serious matter which hasn't been dealt with or has been dealt with lightly. In the 2 years of on-off election campaign in Israel since 2020 until Bennett became a prime minister replacing Netanyahu, which was just 7 months ago.
Yeah.
There were a lot of stories and rumors that the Netanyahu government, that the Netanyahu court, that the Netanyahu inner circle were spying against their opponents. There were reports that Benny Gantz, who is now defense minister, but then was the candidate against political candidate fighting against Netanyahu, that his telephone was hacked, and it was attributed that the Iranians hacked the telephone. And then the former police commissioner complained that detectives, private eyes were following him. These things haven't been at all investigated. And it's time, as part of the larger Pegasus phenomena and investigation, which Israel is going to investigate, these questions also has to be in the investigation. Who spied against whom? Who launched these or other tools? I'm sure we will discover a lot of dirt by maybe this government, but even more so by the previous government.
Right. So last questions to the two of you. Omer, earlier, I think Yossi made the point that it's not just the seller, which is Israel in this case, but also the buyer, the purchaser, India, for example. Now, both are responsible, and there's a lot of hypocrisy all around. But let me just bring Donald Trump's America into this. Now, they bought a limited device, or the spyware, whichever you like. But then the Joe Biden government decides not to use it. Now, what do you make of that in Israel?
Two things. So I want to say one thing. Governments who buy this tool historically are governments who cannot develop it by themselves. With the American case, that's not what's happening. It's something very different and something much more interesting. I want to tell you a story about another Israeli firm called Cellebrite. Cellebrite are famous because they were invited by the FBI to break into the phone of the San Bernardo's shooter or bomber. I don't remember. I think he was a shooter. And for years they would talk about this, how they managed to crack that iPhone. Except there's one problem. It turned out years later that the FBI just brought them and a few other companies to try to hack the phone. The FBI had done it in-house, but they didn't want anyone to know that the FBI had these capabilities. So this firm, was going around there. We cracked the San Bernardo's phone. We were the first ones to break an iPhone, a locked iPhone. But turns out the Americans know how to do this in-house. That's the same thing. Same thing. The FBI wanted to buy it because they wanted to reverse engineer. We know this from Snowden. The Americans are listening, so maybe there are some agencies there who want to have this capability more agile or quicker than they currently have it. And I think that's also what happened in Israel. The Israeli will tell you that if the government needs, our secret services, the Mossad, the Shin Bet, can listen in on people. We generally trust them to be responsible and not do it for no random reason. For example, not to do it against politicians. But we know they have this capability. The reason the Israeli police bought this system is because they don't have those capabilities. And every time they wanted to have it done, they couldn't do it because it doesn't make sense legally, right? Israel, I think, has reserved this for actual, terrorism or stuff because they don't want to abuse it. At least the Shin Bet or the kind of wider part. Right. The police wanted this because they wanted a skill that they knew they shouldn't have, and a skill they couldn't develop by themselves. They wanted to play like the spies. And then once you give them tools like spies, then it's police. It's not even a question of cutting corners. If you can work 4 months and find the evidence on someone, and you can do the same thing in 2 hours by infecting their phone, you'd probably do it in 2 hours and not waste 4 hours of your 4 months of your life chasing sources. Even journalists would do the same thing, right? If I could spy on people, maybe I'd also take advantage of that instead of working hard. And that's the problem with these technologies. For something that is almost too good to be true. And then the moment it reaches someone's hand, it doesn't matter if they're democratic or fascist or illiberal, anyone would abuse it. Anyone.
Mm-hmm. Omer made a very interesting point, which shows the hypocrisy, but also the problems we are facing, philosophical, technological problems we are facing nowadays. The reason why the FBI invited an Israeli company, Cellebrite, to break into an iPhone used by a terrorist who killed American citizens was because Apple, as a company, it's a transnational, it's a government, it's above government. Apple refused to cooperate with the authorities, with the FBI, and with the court, saying, no, it's our secret. It's like, I don't know, you're going to buy a Coke and they refuse to give you the recipe. But
Right.
you say, there is a poison in the recipe. I want to heal people. And still they refuse to let you, because their secret, their commercial secret, their money machine and revenue is more important than the life of people and the law. And that's a problem. That's a philosophical problem we are facing nowadays. And then there is, even you mentioned Trump. Even Trump was very cautious. He allowed the FBI to test the tool, the software, Pegasus software, for 2 years, but didn't buy it and didn't use it operationally. My assumption is they were never interested to use it operationally. They just wanted to learn the technology, and then probably they would produce their own system based or similar on Pegasus.
Yeah, I mean, that's interesting. But, I'm just thinking about the Indian example as I hear both of you talking, is that when they, according to the information that we have from the stories, your stories in the Haaretz and in the New York Times, is that it was sold to an Indian intelligence company, right? Now we have two intelligence agencies, the external one and the internal one. Now, who is spying on, journalists and lawyers and sort of civil society activists? Nobody knows. And the question is that while there is a case now in our own Supreme Court regarding this, but there's no information about what's going on. So there's so much darkness. I mean, it's also clouded, this whole story in India. But if I were to listen to you both, I would, what you're saying very clearly is that the Indian intelligence agency that owns this spyware today is able to use it on anybody it likes. But
the way the NSO license work, and this is what you said before, is very important. NSO, when they sell something to you as a government, it comes with an end user agreement that you have to sign on. So there's also ethical restrictions there. It says you can't use it for blah, blah, blah. And there's also technical limitations. For example, it can only work in certain parts of the world, or cannot work in certain parts of the world. For example, you can't use it against Israelis if you're, say, the Indian government. Yeah. But this license also comes with like a limit of usage. You can say, 40 numbers a day, right? 30 numbers a day. You could, or 100 numbers a month, calculated weekly. Yeah. So there's different like licensing models, right? Once a certain body has this license, nothing prevents them doing it for another body, right? So in Israel, what the story we know, and we don't know anything yet for sure, the targets. We know the police bought this system. And we know, or at least what's being suggested, is that they didn't use it just for themselves. They were also helping, the tax authority, the anti-fraud authority. So it became this kind of catch-all for other requests. In Poland, the body who had bought this Pegasus is the Anti-Corruption Investigation Agency, right? It's like a small body that gets funding from the Supreme Court to fight corruption. And yet, still, the government has managed to use it. So I think we shouldn't get too hung up on who buys it, because I think a lot of times it kind of matters, right? So yes, of course it matters if it's the FBI or the CIA, but I don't think it's that big of a difference if it's the FBI or the DEA. You know what I mean?
absolutely.
So I don't. Yeah, it's of course there's distinctions and it matters, and of course if you're an Indian citizen, it matters greatly if it's being used to spy, for example, on targets in Pakistan or against journalists. But I don't fully buy that this, it's just because of the person who bought it. Like once you have this license, you can use it for,
Yossi, your last comments on Pegasus and what do you think the responsibility should be both on the buyer, in this case NSO, in this case the Indian government, for example, and the seller?
Everyone has to be blamed. The company, NSO, or any other company as a buyer, the government, the Israeli government, which is approving it while turning a blind eye about how it is used. And of course, the purchaser, the buyers, sellers, governments, companies, all of them are becoming very, very rigid and lax and don't and don't really care about basic values of human rights and even in democratic society. And that has to be fixed. And I think in that sense, the Pegasus phenomena is making people aware. We knew that, technology is now taking over people.
Gentlemen, thank you so much for your time. Omer Benjakob,
thank you so
tech
much.
editor of Haaretz, and Yossi Melman of an well-known intelligence analyst. Thank you so much for joining me on the program.
Thank you.
Bye.